Okay, now before we really get into looking at how departments, how to calculate departments' profits and their contribution, I want to show you an overview of how one company that sells shoes and clothing allocates its expenses from the support department, so that when you look at all of the expenses overall, okay, you end up with having your total expenses right here, you can see, allocated totally to shoes and clothing. So you get a good idea of how each department is supporting the operation. So to do this, you have to do some fine-tuning, and it's kind of extensive, so I thought I would show it to you in its totality so you can understand why we do some of the things that we do. So the first thing we do is we're going to look at floor space, and we need to find out how to allocate the expenses that we have in advertising and administration. And the first thing we're going to allocate is utilities. This is utilities. And there is, down at the bottom here, we have expenses, utilities, indirect. So we are allocating indirect expenses right now to each department because that's what we have to get out of the way first. So to do that, we're using floor space. So my floor space right here is listed here. So you just copy those here, and now you're going to add them up. Now we want to figure out the percent of the total of the floor space. So again, I have copied these over. I've taken the full floor space here, and I have divided this 1120 by 14,000 and come up with 8%. 14,000 by 1,400 and come up with 10%, and so on. So it comes to 100%. Now, my utilities were $64,000, so I can allocate based on this percentage. So what I end up doing is multiplying 64,000 times 8%, and do that for all of them, and this is my utilities allocation. Now, what do I do with that is, I'm going to hold on to it for right now. And you'll see right here, I could come down actually and do this now, and I might be better off to do that. I'm allocating indirect utilities at $64,000, and this is what each one of the departments get per this allocation. So you could copy those down and have that done. This is a worksheet that's going to summarize everything we do at the top. So our next allocation is going to be for advertising. And advertising is going to be allocated, their costs is going to be allocated by the number of ads placed for shoes or clothing. So this tells us there were 120 ads. There were 90 for shoes and 30 for clothing, a total of 120. Again, you lay this out and we find out 75% and 25%. So what was our advertising costs? We need to go find that, right? And advertising costs, surely I have that. Advertising costs are I'm stuttering, right? Advertising costs are $23,120. So we're going to allocate that $23,120 and find out $17,340 is going to go to the shoes, and $5,780 are going to go to the clothing. So if I come down and I find my advertising cost right here is $23,120, and I'm going to allocate $17,340 to shoes and $5,780 to clothing. We've got that. So that takes care of my allocation for advertising. The next one was administration. So for administration, I'm looking at allocating via sales. So I have shoes generated 273 and clothing 77 for a total of 350. And we now have an allocation base of 78 and 22%. And the costs to be allocated are 31,400. So I just multiply this times the 31,400 and come up with the 2492 and the 6908. Okay, so now I'm going to take those down, and here's my administration. It says 31,400, and those costs are generated, and here is the allocation here. So we have laid that out. So I've laid out the 21,120 and the 31,800. So now all I have to do is come down and look at this and say, okay, what have I got going on for me? Well, let's look up here and see how we've laid this out. Okay, so where am I getting all these expenses? Well, first of all, direct expenses, which I found up here, all right? These are my direct expenses. If I plop those into this, so there's 18,000, 25,000, 103, and 15. So that has been allocated, and total expenses are 161,000. My indirect, we allocated, right, with utilities of 51, 640, 32, and 1940. So now we've added those together, and you'll see this is where we came up with the 23,120 and the 31,400. So we've allocated those, we've added those up, and we have total departmental expenses of 225. That makes sense? Now, I don't want the advertising department and the admin department absorbing these costs. I want these costs to be put into shoes and clothing so I can have a good idea of how much support services they're being allocated. So having said that, I'm going to take that 23,120 and separate it like I did up here. So this gets removed from the spreadsheet to 0 and is allocated here and here. Same thing for admin. It's removed out of this department and added here and here. And now we have total expenses. If I'm looking at, for an internal purposes reports, of 177,472 for shoes, and clothing is at 47,528. So because this is really overhead, we've reallocated the overhead into the departments using various methods. One is sales, one is ads, and one is floor space. So you can mix and match how you allocate that so that it matches the expense and how it's being used. So that's kind of an overview of why we do divisional stuff or departmental stuff, is so we can get a good handle on how the overhead is affecting the productivity or the profitability of each department. So now, on to how we do this, and a little bit of the other calculations that we use.